It's a privilege to be here today. My name is Chris McCoy. I'm a recent graduate of UC San Diego, and my paper is entitled America's Role in the End of Apartheid in South Africa. It's available online, published on the prospectjournal.ucsd.edu, which is the undergraduate outlet for research. The research question that I answer in this paper is what U.S. policy was most influential in ending apartheid in South Africa. I developed this research paper in a class of Dr. Menna Demessie, who's co-chaired this conference back in 2011, and was able to inform my research with the help of a political scientist at UCLA, Dr. Ronald, who is not only an expert on American politics, but also has spent extensive time in South Africa and was also involved in the civil rights movement here in America. My thesis is that the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, which enacted economic sanctions and political conditions on South Africa's Afrikaner regime, combined with President Ronald Reagan's ineffective policy of constructive engagement, is what led to the fall of the apartheid system in South Africa. So first, let me explain what exactly apartheid is. Apartheid, as defined in my paper, is a system of governance based on racial segregation. It's often used in many different contexts, talking about political conflicts around the world. My colleague here mentioned it in reference to some situations in the Caribbean. But in South Africa, apartheid was the 15% white minority population exerting political and economic control over the 85% black majority population. And this apartheid system resembled what we had here in the United States during the Jim Crow era of segregation and inequality instituted by the government. This system of apartheid was made possible by several pieces of legislation, including the Popular Registration Act of 1950 that required all citizens to register themselves as a certain race, the Group Areas Act of 1950, which mandated public segregation and ultimately benefited the white minority population, giving them access to better resources and better accommodations. Also, the Suppression of Communism Act in 1950, which limited political participation of many black people who were involved in the political process by labeling them as communists and effectively silencing them in the political process. America and South Africa were growing in their military and economic alliances and partnerships, starting from the 1950s with a $112 million arms deal in the early 50s. This grew even into the late 70s. In 1979, they had their first nuclear agreement. Even though here in America, we had already had legislation such as Brown versus Board of Education, which stopped segregation in schools, and we had gone through civil rights struggles here in America. We were still becoming military friends and allies with this regime that was mandating inequality and a very racist and terrible system of apartheid. Also, in this later on in the 80s, when President Ronald Reagan was leading the country, he had a policy of constructive engagement towards the South African government, which was basically appeasement of this institutional racism. It was friendly persuasion and saying that he was doing something when he really wasn't. I argue that it's President Ronald Reagan's policy of constructive engagement and its utter ineffectiveness that frustrated people on the ground and actually strengthened the grassroots movements that were happening here in America. It emboldened people such as Randall Robinson, who was the head of Trans-Africa. They started leading marches, protests, sit-ins. They started pressuring the members of Congress to do something. And also this pressure was sparked by more international media attention on the violence and inequality that was happening between blacks and whites in South Africa. So finally, after 15 years after Representative Ronald Dellums from Oakland, the District of Oakland and Berkeley, initiated the sanctions package in Congress, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act was passed in 1986 with bipartisan support and enough support to even override President Ronald Reagan's veto of this bill. And what was so significant about this legislation is that it prohibited U.S. trade with South Africa. It also mandated political conditions to be met in order for the trade to begin again, such as the release of Nelson Mandela and also the legalization of certain groups such as the African National Congress, which Mandela was a leader in before he was in prison. This Anti-Apartheid Act led to multinational action and international front in solidarity against apartheid in South Africa. It led to the UN Security Council enacting sanctions in 1987, which basically made it so that South Africa and their racist system of apartheid could no longer be sustained financially. They didn't have the money, the international banks wouldn't renew their loans, so they couldn't continue on the way they were. 1989, President de Klerk was elected. He was a more progressive white South African. He legalized nonviolent dissent in South Africa. He legalized the African National Congress, which before had been blacklisted and deemed communist and militant. And this also led to the release of Nelson Mandela, who had been in prison for over 30 years in 1990. Once Mandela was released, that was the symbol that showed that apartheid was going to end. And apartheid did end in 1994 with the election of a black majority legislature in South Africa. So in conclusion, the ineffectiveness of President Ronald Reagan's policy of constructive engagement, which amounted to appeasement and doing nothing in relationship to South Africa's racist apartheid system, combined with the economic sanctions made possible by the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, was the most effective American policy in ending apartheid in South Africa.
Thanks to all of you panelists. And now I want to open it up for questions. We have about 15 minutes, well actually 5 minutes. Not many minutes for questions, but we do have time and we can take 5 additional minutes if we need to. So let's open it up for questions.
Let me just ask one question, or maybe a comment. I only heard the last paper in full. I'm making Howard University, just retired, so yes. But I appreciate your thesis. But what it also, and I don't think you meant to do this, it actually dismisses the critical role that the liberation